Right, well the bell has struck, so let's make a start. Thank you very much for coming, and we are recording this event for posterity because we have with us two very distinguished members of St Catharine's College. I'm not going to go through their biography. You have a sheet there which will tell you just a little bit of what you should know about our two guests. The most important thing by far, of course, is that they were at this college, and they were here at the same time, albeit one, I think, in a higher year than the other.
Yes, Nigel was ahead of me, as he always has been.
And they are both also honorary fellows at the college. So we will have plenty of opportunity for you to ask questions, but I thought I would sort of kick off with some of my own. And we also have some musical interludes. I've asked Robert and Nigel to supply a couple of suggestions to be played over our wonderful sound system that we have here, courtesy of Nigel, in fact. And then we'll open it to the floor. But I guess the first thing and the obvious question to ask of you both is about your experience here at St Catharine's and indeed at the university. And in fact, what exactly did you learn which was useful to you as composers, if anything? Who wants to go first?
He does.
Oh,
Nigel.
do I?
I can see him desperate.
Do you want the polite answer or the real answer?
We want the
real answer. Okay. Well, I suppose CATS and the university in general taught me something that I wasn't prepared for, which was continuing my love of theatre and music. And when I got involved with Footlights, that set me off on a path that really I can trace all the way now to what I'm doing now. And I wasn't expecting that when I first came up. And in fact, my first term at CATS was miserable. I'm being very honest now, because I felt that I didn't fit in. I felt that I wasn't, clever enough. And I think a lot of students go through that sometimes when they first come up to an august place like this. And it was really through getting to know the people in the theatre community, and then, of course, after that, the music community, that I started to spread my wings. And of course, by my final year, I was putting shows on and putting concerts on, and president of the Music Society, and they were having the whale of a time. And it was a real transition. And it was sort of Phoenix.
Those are all their activities which are, you might say, extracurricular. I mean, what about the actual course and the composers that you encountered here?
Is this where I tell my story about falling asleep during Palestrina?
Oh,
maybe that's for later. But no, it was great because you were able to run the course obviously alongside all these extracurricular activities. And when I came up, we had the wonderful Peter Lahure, the much missed Peter Lahure, who was then the music tutor. And he was absolutely extraordinary. And he not only supported the curriculum stuff, but also would come to shows, would be sitting there in the front row at the ADC seeing the latest Footlight show. And he thought that was as important as the course stuff. And I suppose it's the same if you're into sports or into something that isn't necessarily associated with what you're meant to do here. The university, and then by definition the college, also seemed to support those extracurricular activities, because it was clear that, in my case, that was what was going to push me out into the world from CATS. And I've never forgotten that. It was, I thought, so enlightened that they didn't say, why haven't you been to the so-and-so lecture? I was saying, well, we were doing a dress rehearsal of Dick Whittington. And they said, great. So it was, from that point of view, it was a very happy time.
Robert?
It's very similar in some ways. I had been told at school by more than one of the music staff not to apply to university. They were probably right, actually. And if I did, certainly not to try and do music, because they'd had some very good musicians at the school, two of whom are very well-known conductors nowadays. And one is quite notorious, actually. And I thought I'd have a go, and I got into Birmingham University, and I enjoyed my interview there, and then found that having come and had an interview on a wintry night with Peter Lahoure, that he'd offered me a place. And I thought, you know, what a nice man. There must be something wrong with him. Anyway, I came, and like Nigel, my first term I didn't enjoy very much. I was going down to London for lessons with my composition teacher, Elizabeth Lutyens, and she was quite a radical person. And I had told her this, and I thought she'd say, yes, you know, pack it in, you know, all those old fuddy-duddies. And she said, how dare you? I told her that David Wilcox, who was my harmony teacher, although Peter oversaw me, David did my harmony and counterpoint in my first term, first year, and she said, how dare you, Mr. Wilcox is trying to teach you something serious. I also spoke to my father, who instead of saying, how dare you waste an opportunity like that, said, yes, by all means leave Cambridge, just let you remind you that when I was your age, I was in a tank in North Africa. And all in all, I stayed, and like Nigel, I'm very, very glad I stayed. I made some wonderful friends, including Nigel. I think. I'm just winking to make sure. And we had a new music group. We were given £12 a term by the music faculty, and we gave concerts in here and other places of what was then very current, Messiaen, Berio, Dalla Piccola, all sorts of things, and our own pieces. And the course, you asked about the course, I realised that I'd got to take parts of it very, very seriously, and there were parts I could never do, like acoustics, because I hadn't done A-level maths. In fact, I failed O-level maths, which was a terrible thing in my family, because my maternal grandfather, who was a Polish immigrant, came to England aged 14, got a double first in maths at Queen's. And so this didn't go down terribly well when I failed O-level. But anyway, I retook it. I found a lot of the music course interesting, but I have to admit that there were corners of it that I couldn't see why I was doing it, like deciphering lute tablatures from the early 17th century. And now, of course, having spent most of the last 43 years lecturing to students and teaching them, or trying to, things like that, I realised retrospectively, were amazingly useful when you were discussing notation, and you have a student who, particularly towards the end of my teaching career, thought that all notation was as you see it on computer software. And you say, actually, in the history of Western music alone, let alone anywhere else, music notation has not always looked like that. And there were so many things I learned. And I had a wonderful time.
And this was a period where, you know, a particular kind of musical modernism was at its height. This early 70s, right? So
yeah.
We've got the Darmstadt school.
Oh,
we've
absolutely.
got Stockhausen and, as you say, Dalla Piccola and Boulez, of course.
Who was conductor of the BBC Symphony Orchestra at that time.
Were those was that kind of orthodoxy imposed on you as students? Were you encouraged to compose like that?
The only time I can remember being encouraged to compose something I didn't want to compose was, I don't know if it's still the case, but it was either in part 1 or part 2, you had to write something using the 12-tone system, which I suppose is, again, relevant to being early to mid-70s, because that was very much de rigueur at that time.
Yeah.
And I remember sitting writing this piece of music feeling so depressed, because it went against everything that I thought music should do. And I still believe that. But I did it and actually got quite good marks for it, which was even more depressing. But that's the only time I can remember. I mean, I remember for my finals, I actually submitted some arrangements that I'd done for footlights. I was allowed to put in some footlights arrangements as part of the, you know, the final sheaf of things that we submitted. And they were accepted with open arms. You know, there again, you know, that was terrific. They weren't looked down on at all, because they realised that actually I was learning so much by doing that, that it was equally important as everything that was on the course.
Yes, I should just add to that, that the new young composition lecturer in my last year here was at Keys, Robin Holloway, who, thank goodness, still with us and has just celebrated his 80th birthday. We were exactly 10 years apart. And he was a wonderful supervisor. He saw me through my paper on the Ring and Wagner, because I would rather do it with him than the person I'd been allotted. And again, I was allowed to change. And I remember, you know, I was, well, where he was having a lot done in those days, he just had a new piece done at the Proms called Domination of Black, conducted by Sir Charles Groves. And I remember going into Robin's room in Keys in those days. It was before he lived in Fenella off West Road. And I put my foot in it straight away, thinking, oh, he's not really interested in modernism. And I mentioned something about Boulez's Le Marteau sur Maître, and he whipped out the score and said, which bit are you talking about? And do you know Charles Ives' 3 Places in New England? Well, you should. And he soon sorted me out. And having had Elizabeth Lutyens, who was a very, very good teacher in detail, Robin sort of chewed me up and spat me out and whirled me around. And I'm very grateful to him.
So, I mean, I think many of us would be curious about the how process of actually teaching composition. I mean, obviously there are certain techniques that you need to understand. And you need to understand that the viola only goes down to that C. I mean, believe it or not, some people do.
Actually, Richard Strauss wrote a bottom F for the violin in one piece. Yes.
And there are sort of certain basics, but once a composer has sort of found roughly their technique, I mean, this is particularly for you, Robert, I suppose, because you've been teaching composition a great deal.
Shall I start off with it? Well, basically, I was very lucky in that Elizabeth Lutyens, who I got to via Benjamin Britten, because I'm partly East Anglian, so there was a connection there. Elizabeth Lutyens, although she was known as 12-tone Lizzie, she, of course, had great respect for what she called musical discipline and architecture. After all, her father was a distinguished architect. And she had been taught by Harold Darke at the Royal College of Music, who, of course, was an organist. She always said she was very glad that she didn't go to Vaughan Williams, because Harold Darke was a very good technician and an organist. And she'd also been at the École Normale in Paris. And so she'd done all the French contrapuntal training and everything. And she always said to me, it's interesting what Nigel said, as I wanted to learn a 12-tone technique. And she said, look, I'm only going to teach you the basis of 12-tone technique if you always remember that you're writing music. You're not doing exercises. And so she got down to, she never discussed style, she always discussed process, as if you were doing 16th century counterpoint. And she was very, very, she didn't like Schoenberg's music, although her husband was a pupil of Schoenberg. Aesthetically, she was miles away from it. And so then when I came here and worked with David Wilcox and Alan Ridout and then Peter Leverret, and then Robin, but he wasn't doing stylistic techniques with me. It was always the way you tried to solve a problem. It was always about solving problems, as if you were playing chess, but at the same time trying to produce a result that was music. And that was my experience, and I tried to hand that on to my students. Whether I succeeded or not, I have no idea. But I always tried to say to them, what are you wanting to do? What are you trying to do? And even if they said, oh, well, this is no good, the first thing I would say, I'm not saying everybody else should or does, is to say, well, just hang on before you throw it away. Let's just have a look at this, bearing in mind that the opening of Beethoven's first piano sonata is the same motive as Mozart's G minor symphony, and say, hang on a minute, you don't have to have an original idea. What's inside this material? What can we do with it? Like playing with plastic.
And of course, the marvellous thing that Cambridge offers, like any community of students where there is a music course, is that you are surrounded by people who will actually play your music, and it's the best way of learning, because you're learning on the job. You know what works, but more importantly, what doesn't work. By the time I got to my second year, which was the year that you arrived, I was rushing around finding groups and putting groups together, throwing music in front of them and saying, play this. Didn't have to be for a concert. It was just, they happened to be, a group was rehearsing, and so I threw some music in front of them and said, could you just play this? I'd just like to listen to this. Well, where else can you do that except in a community like this?
That is true, but can I also say, and I don't mean this in any sort of falsely flattering way, you are an exceptionally fluent musician, and that we all knew the minute we arrived. I mean, you can literally do anything standing on your head.
That's very kind of you to say so.
And I can remember an extraordinary show I went to of the Footlights, which you and Simon Jolly were doing with Griff Rhys-Jones.
Oh, goodness, yes.
Griff Rhys-Jones was dressed as a hillbilly. And it was the most extraordinary thing. And I remember just these amazing shows.
Yeah, well,
and events.
That was why it was such a great training, because one minute you were having to write something that was a hoedown, hillbilly hoedown, and then you had to do a Bach or Mozart pastiche and make it sound convincing. Yeah. And you couldn't sit there and say, well, no, I'm sorry, I don't do that. You just had to do it. And that went on into, that's what my career became as well.
I feel there's a perfect segue from hoedown to Mahler's Resurrection.
Is this the lowdown?
That's an interesting segue.
I've asked both our guests to consider it's not exactly the question, what's your favourite piece of music? It's more, what's the piece of music you would most like to have composed? And Nigel's chosen the final segment of Mahler's Resurrection Symphony. I mean, do you want to set this up at all in terms of...
Not really, because I'm sure everybody knows it, and I wouldn't dare to sort of say anything about it. But actually, I would rephrase the question, is that what piece of music do you wish you'd been able to write? And this goes so far beyond any realm that I work in, that I just, every time I hear it, and particularly in live performance, I'm just in awe that this can come out of even though I'm surrounded by musicians and wonderful composers, but this can come out of somebody's brain is just extraordinary. It features in the new film about Leonard Bernstein, which I went to a screening of. It's called Maestro, with Bradley Cooper playing Leonard Bernstein. And ignore all the pre-publicity you've heard about the nose. Forget about that. It's all absolutely fine. And they filmed this last section in Ely Cathedral with Bradley Cooper playing Leonard Bernstein, conducting this last piece. And they do it extremely well. I don't know if it was Bradley actually conducting, but they do it extremely well. And it's interesting that they chose this piece to illustrate Bernstein's command of all the forces.
Well, let's hear it.
Doesn't get much better than that, does it? Amazing.
I pulled up Mahler's program note on that, because he wrote a program note on the whole symphony, and it finishes with a feeling of overwhelming love fills us with blissful knowledge and illuminates our existence. I mean, you wouldn't necessarily write that program note of your own music, but nevertheless, I think it's probably about...
It's very, very apt. Absolutely, absolutely.
I want to move on then to talk about your careers, because you both had very successful careers in the music business, and perhaps we can think about it partly as a business, but very different ones. And I wonder if I could ask you to reflect a little bit on, where it started, where you started, and where you are now in terms of how has that business changed? How has the business of getting commissioned or getting work and all that changed over the years, and whether you feel sort of hopeful about the future for younger composers? That's a lot of questions.
I was going to say, let's break that down.
Can I just come in first by asking Nigel a question? Can I be your sort of Sue interview?
You didn't tell me you were going to do this.
I didn't.
No. Go on.
You have said about arriving at Cambridge, but you actually, I mentioned your amazing natural ability, and you of course have an extraordinary provenance because your aunt, great aunt, is named Mara Hess. And so I'm not saying that helped you career-wise, but do you feel that having that provenance gave you a kind of springboard, psychologically and musically?
I suppose so. It was certainly in the genes somewhere. It skipped a generation, and then I'm very, very grateful that I seem to pick up those musical genes that she had. But I can obviously take no credit for that, and I'm very grateful that did happen. But whether she would have approved some of the areas of music I've since gone into, I don't know. But I remember playing piano to her once. I remember going to see her at her home in St John's Wood, and she wasn't playing anymore, but I sat down and played the piano for her. A popular piece, it wasn't a classical piece. I think I was about 10, and I played something dreadful like A Walk in the Black Forest. It was in the hit parade at the time. And she said I made a nice noise, and that was the only review I ever got from her. But I've hung on to that ever since. So I'm sure it must have helped, certainly.
No, go on.
But so where did when you came out of Cambridge, what direction did you follow, and did you follow it in a way that you sort of knew roughly where you wanted to get to with the music?
Well, for me, yes. During my final year at Cambridge, I decided I had to sort of start sowing roots somewhere else, so that by the time I left Cambridge, I would have some idea of how I was going to actually earn a living and pay the rent, and that's where the business brain started kicking in. And so in my final year here, I got in touch with the chap who'd been musical director of Footlights, keeps coming up again, and he was down in the West End by that time conducting a show that you might have heard of called Jesus Christ Superstar at the Palace Theatre. So I said, could I come down? So while I was still studying for my finals, and I said, could I come down and just see how it all works? And just sit in and see how the show works, because I have a feeling, I might want to get involved in that, and I thought it would be a good entree into London, getting to know some of the work down there. And I'd only been down a couple of times. People said, oh, you play a bit of piano, don't you? And I said, well, yes. And they said, we've got a bit of holiday relief work coming up. And before I knew it, I was performing in the rock group in Jesus Christ Superstar, but up and down on the train from Cambridge to King's Cross during my final year. So that got me into that world. So that when I left Cambridge, I went down to London, just continued with that. And within 6 months, they offered me the conductorship of the show. And so I started conducting the show, and then sort of worked in lots of other theatres. Then gradually got into television, and that's when the composition again started to take over. So it was all as a direct result of all the connections here. It was, but very much knowing that I had to get work straight away because I had to earn a living.
And has it always been a sort of essentially a freelance career?
Always. I've been freelance all my life, apart from 4 years. I've only been 4 years salaried, and that was when I was at the Royal Shakespeare Company. And I actually cut things like holiday pay and stuff like that, which was all very weird. But the rest of the time, no, I've just been a jobbing composer, and luckily been able to pay the rent.
And can I ask you about the sort of particularly the recording business? Because the other piece we're going to play of your choice is a piece which has been wildly successful and been streamed lots of times and stuff. I mean, how does that work for a composer nowadays? I mean, is it something that you're paid up front, or how do the royalties work? I mean,
you really make the money out of the royalties. When I first started out in the business, you could actually be much more business savvy, because I did an awful lot of television series, some films, but mostly television series in the 80s and 90s. And in those days, you could hang on to your publishing, because the music business hadn't got wise to the fact that a lot of the royalties came through half being a composer and half being a publisher. So you became your own publisher, you got 100% royalties. And I learnt this very, very quickly. So a lot of the television series that get repeated now on all those weird channels that go at 3 o'clock in the morning, I'm now that's paying off, because I now get the royalties coming back because I was able to do good deals. Nowadays, going into the business, and I'm sure you know, Robert, you can't do that. People have got wise, and they say, no, either we're going to take all the publishing and we'll just buy you out. I mean, the American model for years and years has been like a sweatshop, in that they just pay you for writing the music, and that's the end. You get no royalties, you get nothing at all. Luckily, we haven't got quite to that stage yet. But there again, this is part of splitting your brain between actually the writing, the creation of the music, but then being very aware of how that music is going to go out into the world and give you a living. And sometimes people find it quite difficult to put those two together. But luckily, I've sort of been able to run the two alongside, and I have my own publishing company, and that sort of works very well.
So for Robert, I guess it's a different model, one of commissioning, and I think most recently crowdfunding, which is an interesting.
Yep. I mean, when I was in my final year here, I had written a piece based on the W.H. Auden poetry, which I managed to get copyright permission for from Favours. And I sent it into a competition in Holland, and to my total astonishment, won the competition. And that did help, because a publisher started getting interested. And Elizabeth Lutyens warned me. She said, be careful, don't publish and record immediately or whatever. It wasn't so easy to record in those days, because you'll regret it in 30 years. You'll say, oh God, not that piece, you know. I then went from here as a postgraduate to Worcester College, Oxford, partly because Robert Sherlock Johnson, who had been at York University in the new, really with it department, had gone to Worcester College, Oxford, and he was the external examiner for my finals. And Peter Lahore said, Dr. Sherlock Johnson wants to see you. And I thought, oh my God, I failed my finals. This wouldn't happen nowadays, I think. And I went in, and there was Robert in his customary way, very shy for doing this. And he said, would you like to come and work with me and do your B.Mus at Oxford? And I said, really? I'd never been to Oxford in my life. And I sort of said, where is it? And do I need a visa, And anyway, I went there and did my B.Mus, and then after that, B.Mus is a postgraduate course at Must Be at Cambridge, B.Mus at Oxford, and then I started teaching A-level for tutorial colleges. I did have some very bad students, and I had one or two really remarkable students, one of whom, Dominic Aldis, is a very distinguished jazz pianist now and everything. And I taught A-level, and then I taught at the Guildhall for a bit, and I was getting a few commissions, and the publishers were helping a little bit, but... and at BBC were very kind. I got a couple of proms commissions, because in those days the producers would very much support you, and they would actually say, what do you want to write? I did a bit of teaching at the Guildhall School of Music and Drama, then I left, then I went back. Then I went as a lecturer to Bristol University. I had to go through all the interview process and everything. Then after that, I got a fellowship, which was interviewed for, to go to Princeton in America for a year. And I got quite a lot of work while I was there, but none of it was lucrative. I wasn't earning, I mean, you know. Then I came back to the Guildhall as head of composition. Then after 8 years of that, I went to the Royal Academy of Music in London as head of composition and contemporary music, and I thought I'd be there till I retired. Until Robert Johnson, bing, again, Peter Lahoyer and Robert Johnson rang up and said, I'm retiring. I think you should apply for my job at Worcester College, Oxford. And I said, well, I'm 45. They probably don't. Well, he said, no, they may well not want you, but I think you'd be silly if you didn't have a go. And I went up and I did a mock lecture and was interviewed at the college and at the faculty, and I didn't like any of it at all. I thought, I don't think I want to come back into this world at all. And at the following weekend, I was rung up by the chair of the panel, who said, it was a very odd way of offering somebody a job. We're going to offer you the post, but you don't have to accept it. And I thought, do I read between the lines there? Or? Anyway, I did accept it, and for 23 years, until 3 years ago, I was at Oxford. I've always, you know, I've earned my living. I love teaching, and I've loved having students, but I am now really glad to be getting back to taking my wife in. She's still teaching, singing at the Trinity Laban in Greenwich. We never moved to Oxford, we've always stayed in South East London. And I like going into my study and writing music, and I've still got a lot of composition work, but it isn't lucrative. And in fact, I am, for the first time in my life, age 70, writing an easy listening album for a publisher.
Good for you.
God knows what will happen to it. I may be coming to you for a lesson.
Shall we move on to your sort of choice of piece you would like to have composed?
Yes, this is the third movement of the Debussy's Cello Sonata, 1915, written, 17 years after the Resurrection Symphony of Mahler, something like that. Debussy was very ill when he wrote this, and of course the First World War was on. It was a set of meant to be 6 sonatas, but ended up as 3 that he wrote when he was very ill. The piece is about 12 minutes overall, it's very short. The opening is based on Baroque French music, not actually he's not quoting, but Marc-Antoine Charpentier and François Couperin and Louis Couperin. He adored that music, and the opening reflects it. And the whole piece is somehow almost commedia dell'arte. He was going to call the slow movement Pierrot fâché avec la lune, Pierrot angry with or worried by the moon, and it was written 3 years after Schoenberg's Pierrot Lunaire and Petrushka of Stravinsky. It was very much in the air. And the last movement suddenly bursts into this extraordinary joy. It's sad, but it's also joyful. And I, as a composer, why I've chosen it is that I would love to have been able to do that. The way it suddenly starts, rather like the catalogue aria does in Don Giovanni. And the rhythmic detail, coupled with the larger rhythmic phrasing and breathing of the music, the way the cello and the piano are collude and then fall apart, almost like Columbine and Harlequin. And you never know, however well you know it, you're never quite sure what's coming next. And then the way it explodes and finishes is just complete magic to me. Just magic.
Well, let's hear it.
Do we know who's playing? Oh, no.
That before.
It's
brilliant.
Beautiful.
Brilliant.
We're on to that section of the session where we get to hear a piece from each of our guests that they particularly want to sort of share with us. Pieces they're particularly proud of. Nigel, perhaps we'll have yours first.
There was a friend of mine called Billy Brown, no longer with us, sadly, who I met when I worked at the RSC. We wrote some shows together for the RSC, and very close friends. And he was he's Australian, and he'd gone back to Australia, then came over again, and was celebrating his 50th birthday, so quite a while ago. And we gave him a party at our house, and he said, you can invite whoever you like, past friends, people he'd met while he'd been over here. One of the people he invited was the actor Charles Dance, and he came to our house for the party, and we were sitting and had a few drinks, and Charlie said, I'm working on this script, and I'm hoping that Judi Dench and Maggie Smith are going to do it, because they're great friends. And he says, Billy tells me you're a composer. I said, yes. And he said, well, this film's going to need quite a lot of music. So he said, do you mind if I get in touch with you? And he had a few drinks, and I thought, well, that's the last I'm going to hear of that. And literally a month later, the phone goes, and it's Charlie, and says, I'm going to send you this script. And that ended up being a film called Ladies in Lavender, which indeed Judi and Maggie did do. And it was just a series of happy accidents, because I used a bottom drawer tune, and I bet you have those as well, a tune that's been sitting around for a long time looking for a project. Sometimes I do get ideas, and I never throw anything away. Quickly scribble it down, and I literally have a bottom drawer at home with about 60 different ideas in it. And this project came along, and I managed to fit this tune that I'd been waiting for a project to fit. And I did the usual composer thing about giving the producer and Charlie, the director, 4 different ideas, 3 of which I knew were terrible, but I wanted them to feel that they were making the choice. So I put 3 terrible ideas, and then the bottom drawer tune I just snuck in at the end. And I have been in that situation once, and they've gone for one of the really bad ideas. That's another story. But anyway, they chose the right tune, and then because the film, for people who haven't seen the film, it's about a violinist who gets washed up. Very believable story. A violinist gets washed up on a shore in Cornwall, and they take him in, and he ends up being a star performer. And I said, well, we want a wonderful violinist to do this, somebody like Joshua Bell. And then Sony Pictures suddenly put a lot of money into the film, and of course Joshua Bell is a Sony artist, so they got Joshua Bell to do the film. So that was all great. And there's a direct line through all this, really why I've chosen this piece of music, because it became the Royal Film Performance in 2004, the Queen came to see it, and so I'm told, the next day got in touch with her son Charles and said, knowing he loved music, saying, I've just seen this film, it has some lovely music in it, I think you would enjoy it if you had a private showing at Kensington Palace. And then the next thing I know, I get a call from his office saying he would like to see me because he's got an idea for music he would like to commission. And that was as a direct result of Ladies in Lavender and Charlie Dance coming and getting drunk in our house at a party. So, that's led on to a connection with a joyous connection I really enjoyed with the royal family over the years. And it's amazing, isn't it, the coincidence. Only one of those things could have gone wrong and none of that would have happened. But I mean, you know all about that. Exactly. So
always have a bottle open when Charlie Dance.
Absolutely.
That's the moral.
I knew there was a moral story. That's it.
Let's hear it. It's a beautiful, beautiful piece. Can I just say I didn't write that last note? That was Joshua's idea. I didn't know you could go that high. And we were rehearsing it at my house just before we went into the recording session the previous day, just flown over from America, played it through perfectly the first time, of course.
And he was standing at the piano and he said, "Can I make a suggestion?" I said, "Go on." Then he said, "What about doing that last note? I really don't know." I said, "You can't get out that high." He said, "Just watch me." And he did, and that was Joshua's idea. And I think it's stunning, absolutely stunning.
Even without the last note, it would be.
We're going to move on to Robert's suggestion for a piece that he'd like to share with us. And this is the 20th anniversary of this piece, in fact, isn't it? We were talking about it earlier. Do you want to tell us?
Well, basically, without the story is too convoluted, so we'll skip it. But Edward and I had been put together, as it were. And he asked me to write in a piece for his group, the Clarks, which sang and recorded medieval and early Renaissance repertoire, virtuoso vocal group. And I wrote a piece based on a very ancient poem called The Dialogue of Zion and God, which they did in Hebrew at the Wigmore Hall. And Edward very kindly, instead of, as people sometimes do, saying, "Good luck, old chap," said, "Would you like," he put his foot right in it as far as he was concerned and said, "Would you like to write another piece? But this time, could we have it in Latin?" And my Latin is not good, but it's better than my Hebrew. And so I thought about it, and I decided to write a cycle of motets based on the idea of wandering, because I was working on a piece called The Wandering Jew at the time, which was an opera for the radio about Jesus and the Wandering Jew meeting in a Nazi death camp. And I decided to write a cycle where I used the Bible, Genesis in Latin, and one part of Exodus, and two movements, 2 and 4, poems of my own, one which was about Abraham leaving Ur and coming to the land of Canaan, and it says, is this just an event that happened once, or does it recur, rather like your person being washed up on the Cornish coast? And another one about light. And I feel very close to this piece in a way, but Edward gave me a near fatal shock by contacting me one morning and saying, "We've been offered to do this in a late night prom in 2003. Sorry, you looked a bit puzzled." And I hadn't finished it. And I thought, that was the year of my 50th birthday. And Nick Kenyon very kindly was offering this. So it went a stage further when Edward said, "Well, we're going to perform it in a continuous hour of music late at night in the Albert Hall, just, 9 singers, with His Majesty's, is it cornets and sackbuts, or sackbuts and cornets? And all playing in nomines by Bird and Bird and Ty and Tavern, yeah. And so it'll be just continuous music. And what we want to do is do each of your motets in between the movements of a Josquin mass. So in other words, we'd have Josquin, my piece, and in nomine. Josquin, my piece, and they did this enormous concert. And Edward, I don't know how he did it, conducted it while singing. And the other bit of that was that one of the basses in the concert became our chaplain at Worcester College, Oxford. And so these endless things that go on and on. And the other thing is you then recorded it. I couldn't come to the sessions. I can't remember why. And was it in a church in Cambridge?
Yeah, that one in Chesterton, that big boomy one.
And did this marvellous recording for Signum Records. And we're going to hear the last of the motets, which is a setting in Latin from the Vulgate of Jacob's Ladder, Jacob's Dream. Thank you for singing it, Edward. Edward was singing on that before.
So we have some time. We can make some time now. I'm sorry, it's slightly later than I was expecting, but we should now have some questions from you. If anyone has anything, Don.
This is more about the future, I think, but it has been possible for some time to go onto the internet and request 3 blind mice in the style of Monteverdi or Barber, and that kind of artificial intelligence capacity has amused people. Do you think that it is now the situation where artificial intelligence is a significant threat to creative people in general and composers in particular, because you can ask for a composition using your styles? It can be you, but you're not doing it. Is it a threat? What do you think about the future?
It's already happening.
Yes.
Certainly.
And it was on the radio this morning, incidentally.
Certainly in media, it's been happening for a few years.
Yes.
Especially in low-end productions, they can just dial up sort of 45 or 46 seconds of dramatic music, and out it will come, in the style of, and out it will come.
Yes.
So that it's been a threat for quite a long time, and it is now starting to impinge in different areas. So quite what we do about it, I mean, there are lots of meetings amongst all the music. A lot of the music industry is very worried about it. I don't think it might live to eat my words, but I don't think it will affect what I would call the high end of bespoke composition, because hopefully the sort of things that Robert and I do will still be in demand, if not from us, but from younger composers, and that will carry on. But certainly the ground roots of the business, I think it's a real concern, not only in music, but in all other areas.
Yes, for actors.
Yeah.
I haven't got much to add except 2 things. There's a book by Roger Penrose, Sir Roger Penrose, The Emperor's New Mind, in which, towards the end, he says that he believes that Mozart's 40th Symphony or whatever could only be written by Mozart, not by a computer, because there's something in it, which of course is very difficult. This is dangerous ground. There's something about Mozart's soul or whatever you want to, that infuses it with something. Now, I say that because a colleague of Nigel's in the media, Debbie Wiseman, I was her head of department at Guildhall, contacted me about 3 years ago, if I can just tell this quickly. And she said, I'm doing the music for a television programme about, it's a psychodrama about Mozart speaking from the other side. All to do with the Requiem, And she said the director wants a new Agnus Dei for the Requiem. And I said, well, what's wrong with Süssmayer's? And she said, well, he doesn't think it's very good. And I said, well, it's a lot better than he thinks it is. It just happens not to be by Mozart. Anyway, he said he wants an Agnus Dei that's more like Don Giovanni. And I said, but the Agnus Dei is not a demonic part of the... Anyway, and she said, the reason I'm phoning you is that I want you to do this. I think you should... And I said, really? I don't usually do this. Anyway, I did it. And I spent several days when I wasn't teaching and doing things, really going into the Mozart Requiem, the bassett clarinets, the detailed scoring of the trombones and the choir, and I produced this Agnus Dei, and rather unwisely, I think, for the producer, because they never made the programme because they ran out of money, he paid for Debbie to record it with the BBC, and so I have this bleeding chunk of Agnus Dei, and if it's ever commercially recorded and I make some money, I'll accept the money on Mozart's behalf, gladly. But the reason I'm saying that is that I did my best to convince people that if the Requiem was performed with this Agnus Dei, it would be something like Mozart. But it doesn't obviously have what Mozart would have done. It is a fake. And I only mention it because if I was doing that, and that's another reason I was glad I did the course here, that I could manage to cobble it together, as it were. It's not Mozart, and somebody doing AI might be able to do the job just as well, if not better than I did. And that is worrying. That's why I mentioned it.
But it begs the question, why? You know, why would you do that? I mean, if you only wanted it for technical reasons, then I suppose there is a reason for doing it. But I don't, you know, at that level, what was the point? Just use Mozart, you know?
Well, there isn't at the Mozart Ennius Day for that, and he didn't like the Susma.
No, I wasn't referring to your...
No, but what I meant is that, yes, quite, why would you want a setting of text which doesn't normally have that sort of music? But it was all to do with the fact that it was from the other side. Yes. So one was bowing to...
You said that's what the producer wanted. I mean, we could do a whole separate talk about trying to fulfill impossible requests from producers. And I won't go into it, we'll be here all night.
But that, it's you know...
Can I just interrupt a minute and say that the brief actually was what would Mozart have written if he'd been alive later than he was? That was it, wasn't it?
It had to be stylistically of that period, though.
But it, moved his style onwards. Is that right?
No, the brief was to do it exactly in the style of late Mozart.
Late.
As if he was talking from the grave, you know.
Any other questions? No. Well, we'll wrap it up there. Oh, yes, please.
Just to follow on, when you are composing, how much of the piece is formed and complete in your head? How much do you take yourself by surprise when you're writing? Because I think that gets to the nub of the Mozart question. Mozart would have, in the writing, created something possibly that even he had anticipated, whereas the AI can only do work from the known. Moments.
A sort of algorithm.
I never have, apart from themes, I never have the music, the structure of the music. It's a voyage of discovery each time.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I'm working on a chamber piece at the moment. I have no idea where it's going. No idea at all. It's fascinating. You know, and it does take on a life of its own, and you follow it wherever it wants to go. And those apocryphal stories about Mozart saying, you know, it was all in his head and he just simply had to write it down. Well, you're dealing with somebody who's up in the stratosphere, not us mere mortals.
That's interesting because, of course, Britten and Ravel both said they, in different contexts, that they both completed pieces, but what they now had to do was find the right notes. In what I've talked to mathematicians and physicists about this, you know, I've said to physics colleagues, when you think you've solved a problem, and they said, oh, it doesn't mean we've solved all the equations. It means and what is that? What does that mean? It's very difficult for composers to describe what it is they think they've finished. I have actually written a couple of pieces which are completely planned. One of them was based on planet cycles, and I worked with a mathematician to work out, because I'm so bad at math, to work out all, and it was pre-planned, literally. Not all the notes, but the proportions, all sorts of things to do with reflections, and it's the toughest piece I ever wrote, and people hate it. Well, when it was played, they hated it. So I don't know. I mean, it's not my problem what it is, but it is a difficult one. Could I just add one thing? That it has made a difference to me, and I must say this, having spent 44 years of my life living with a professional singer, because she's often said to me about things about breathing and the way, not just literally, but the way things work and whether singers can learn things, like when I was writing the motets for you, which are very difficult. They're hardly bog standard choral music, whatever that is. And I would just like to thank you, Tess, for all the discussions and the advice and sitting through opera rehearsals, which I would never have thought about, you know, how Figaro works in Breeze, and I want to thank you for that, if I may.
Well, in thanking Tess, we'll thank you as well for... before we give a final round of applause, just to say, you know, we are very proud to have you both as Honorary Fellows, to be members of this college, and to thank you personally for the work that you've done with our choirs, because you've both composed wonderful pieces.
Well, it's due to you.
For the choirs.
You set it all up, Edward.
But we're going to hear some of them. We're going to hear Nigel and Robert's work on St Catherine's Day on Saturday at the service. And we regularly sing both of your music. So thank you for those presents as well. And thank you for being here.
No, thank you.
Really.
Thank you.